There might be less of a test this time than usual. We'll see. That sounds loud to me up here. Is it louder than normal out there? Okay. Walming informed me shortly before the service I'm going out to Bishop Place to preach this afternoon, and that there is a time constraint over there on services. So he said, whatever I have to chop out there, I can just add here. You guys, you're good. I can go real long, right? Which is great because my computer's doing the thing where I have to open it more than once before it unlocks for me. There we go. I don't know if you guys already got some of this last week. I wasn't here. I haven't listened to the service, but I knew I was preaching this week, and I knew it like more than a month ago, but I always wait until the last minute to write my sermon. And part of that is because naturally I'm a procrastinator, but part of that is also because I just kind of like to wait and see if God says there's a message that's needed this week. And ironically, I haven't preached here that many times. I think this is my 5th time out here, but it's the 2nd time I've been here right after pretty significant political violence has broken out. I'm sure you guys all know what I'm talking about with the news with the murder of Charlie Kirk that's been on everyone's mind lately. I know I heard like every church talked about it on Sunday last week, even if the sermon's not necessarily about it. Pastors need to get up and say, hey, this is an impactful thing in our nation. And I don't know if you've noticed out here, but we live in a super divided country. I was out here, I think a year ago, August, and the attempted assassination of President Trump was 2 days before I was supposed to be here. And I'd already written my sermon, so I think I tweaked and threw in a little message about it up front, but it didn't influence what I preached on. Anytime someone brings up anything political from the pulpit, like my skin crawls. I don't know if that's happening with you guys right now. So I'm going to go ahead and I find myself thinking like, okay, they probably know better than to like push a political agenda from the pulpit, but they've probably got something underneath that they're like hoping we'll fall into. And so I just want to lay the cards on the table because I want to make sure you guys aren't worried about hearing that from me. That makes my skin crawl, and I've decided whether or not I will attend certain churches in the past about whether or not I felt like politics were being driven from the pulpit. I'm an independent voter, and I have been my entire adult life. I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat, and I don't care if any of you are either of those things either. So I want you to know that when I talk about things, I'm worried about the heartbeat of people in this country and how we treat those who disagree with each other. And I don't care what you do at the ballot booth. I really don't. I care about how you treat those that are doing different things at the ballot booth than you. That's what the focus of today is going to be. Not to vote anyway, not what news you watch or who you support, just that. So I just want to get that out in the open, and hopefully you don't have to worry about whether I'm doing something deeper or trying to lead you down a different path, because I'm not. This most recent piece of news, like it's not the first time, right? It's been growing a lot lately. I mentioned the attempt on Trump's life about a year ago, a little over. And since then, we've had attacks on the left side of it as well. We had a state senator assassinated in Minnesota earlier this year. Someone violently assaulted, nearly killed Nancy Pelosi's husband a while back. It's really easy to fall into an echo chamber these days. So I want to make sure that I catch people up here on both sides, because I gave all 4 of those examples because I want to make sure we understand that acting in anger towards people that we perceive to be our enemies is not a party thing. It is not something conservatives do. It's not something liberals do. It's proving to be something that Americans do. Now, let's see here. I think I already touched on that. This is not a message today like I usually do when I'm out here or anywhere, where I dig into rarely heard passages or test your familiarity with the books of Numbers or Nahum. I'm not going to be doing anything like that. I'm going to dig into some staples. Passages I'm confident you're already familiar with, but at times familiarity can be as dangerous as ignorance. There's what we call a lullaby effect. You hear something enough and it becomes easy to just tune out and ignore. When you've heard a thing so many times, you don't even really need to think about it anymore and it crosses your ear. So what I want to do tonight, morning. Maybe it's just because I'm tired. I don't know. You all get me up early when I have to drive out here. I'm a college pastor. Mornings are not my thing. Let's turn that lullaby into heavy metal. Let's break up the doldrums so it might reach your ears and actually dig into these passages. And maybe it'll hit a little bit more like Iron Maiden than John Denver. Okay, that's what we're going to be looking at doing today. So we'll be tackling the question about what does Jesus say about engaging our enemies and how differently we should treat them from our allies. So one thing that is going to be standard that you've probably come to expect from me today is before I even open this and read anything, we're going to do some context setting because Hudson loves to talk about historical and cultural context. So we're going to be looking at Jesus' words, but want to talk about the society that they lived in at this point in time and who the people are that he's speaking to. So he lives in a Jewish society, and he's in technically a Jewish kingdom, but they're living under Roman occupation. I want to make sure we actually stop and think about what that actually means to this people, because I think the phrase can be used too gently. Because when we say Roman occupation, it just means like, yeah, the Romans are just kind of out there. They're in the streets with the Jews, and they're acting like citizens in their country, and no, it's a lot further than that. The Romans own Israel. That's what Roman occupation actually means in this sense. They've already conquered it. Israel gets to govern and run itself only to the extent that Rome allows it. This is a puppet kingdom. They get to take a weekly Sabbath and hold their own religious practices only because Rome has decided that it's more valuable to them to let Israel follow that tradition than deal with the rebellion and having to go to war with them again if they put a clamp down on it. Rome would not allow this from any of the kingdoms they rule that are less a theocratic state, to which their religious practices and their actual function as a society are less married. Because you take one day off of work every week, what does that mean? There is 1/7 less tax revenue that comes to Rome. You make less money. That's why Rome wants to run puppet kingdoms, so they can get money out of them. It grows their own wealth. They will restrict, the moment Rome decides that their religion does more harm than good to their own empire, they'll end them. And that does happen, 70 AD, about 35 years after Jesus concludes his ministry here on earth. They don't just set the laws and then kind of get updates on how they're being followed through written correspondence either. They station soldiers throughout big cities, throughout the region, to ensure that Israel doesn't try to be too free. They'll restrict whatever they feel isn't in the spirit of Rome. When the people of Israel pay their taxes, they don't pay them to Israel. They're not paying them to their local state. They pay them to Rome, and Rome will redistribute a part of it, if they think it's helpful for them, back into Israel. But most of it goes right to Caesar. Roman dignitaries live in the city of Jerusalem to ensure that the laws they expect to be upheld are, and they bring the hammer down when they aren't. And those Roman citizens are under no obligation to follow the laws of Israel while they're there. Israel can enforce laws on their own citizen that might be outside of the scope of the Roman laws of the entire empire, but Romans don't have to follow that, which means they can walk the city and act differently and offensively to all the people in town. And the only reproach they have is to deal with it and hope that soldier doesn't beat them up if they show offense. This is the reality of the people in Israel at that time. So with that in mind, no, I skipped a paragraph. Okay, so you're going to hear from time to time I don't know if you're used to hearing this out here. I probably see it on social media a big amount. I don't really hear people say it in person. And I think maybe it's because we know it sounds silly when it comes from our lips, but not as silly when we type it on our keyboards. Christians in America like to respond to, I don't know, school curriculums or lawsuits going through lower courts as an example of religious persecution that's being lobbied at them. And that's kind of an insult to what that looks like in this community. What I don't want you to hear is that we're Jews and the larger government is the Roman Empire in this. That's not really the case. Largely, Christians run or have at least a very important voice in how the country here is run. How the Israelites are going to feel more in this society would probably be a better comparison to the Native American culture in this country. They have their own tribal land, they have their own law enforcement, and to a limited extent, laws. Like they've been able to build casinos for ages, even though gambling was outlawed throughout most of the United States. But the local state governor, senator, or federal officials decide that their independence isn't American enough, they can take it away. The reason being that their true independence as a people was actually taken away from them a long time ago. That's exactly how Israel's living under Roman occupation. That's true of Israel. The only difference is that Rome, well, I shouldn't say the only difference. A large difference, though, is that Rome holds that fact that I just said openly. We don't really like to talk about that too much here. But Rome holds their superiority above them and doesn't pretend to see them as equals. Not at all. Okay? That's the reality of the people of Israel. They're under Roman occupation of people that think they are lesser than, treat them that they are lesser than, have the strength to get away with it, and the law behind them. So with that in mind, we're going to read our first passage today. So we'll be in Matthew chapter 5. This is the opening chapter of Jesus' famed Sermon on the Mount. And we'll be reading verses 43 through 48. I'll be reading out of the NIV. I don't know if you have a different version up here behind me. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends the rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Now we're going to stop and analyze what Jesus is saying here. I know I've talked about this when I've been out here before, but we have to remember what Jesus' profession is. This is where the test starts. What is Jesus' profession? Huh? Ooh, 0 for 1. That's correct. Rabbi, that's what I wanted to hear. We always say carpenter. Did he practice carpentry? Maybe. Historians would actually say, that's not in the text. More likely he was a stonemason, huge stone quarry in the land. That's probably what his dad did. But he worked with his hands to provide some income when needed. But his job was a rabbi. A rabbi was the teacher who had been given authority to interpret the text, to make their own interpretation of what Torah said to their people. If you were not a rabbi, you did not have independence in Jewish culture to actually make your own interpretation about what Scripture meant. You could only follow the interpretations that a rabbi gave. So when he says, you have heard that it was said, what Jesus is saying is, you have this understanding of what Scripture is telling you. And now it's my job to come out and give you a correct understanding of what Scripture is telling you. So when he says that, he's referencing the text. So let's find out what he's referencing. I didn't give you these scriptures ahead of time, so if anyone wants to follow along, I'm just going to read one verse from Leviticus. It's going to be chapter 19, verse 18. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Now, this is pretty self-explanatory. I'm not going to give you a bunch of background and try to explain the context of this particular verse. It means exactly what it says. If they're your people, love them. Simple. There's not anything around this text that is needed to put it into place. It sits in the middle of a verse or a chapter that's just laws. Each verse is a different command and a law. It's right in the middle of that. Okay? It means exactly what it looks like it means. But that only explains the love your neighbor part, right? Jesus says something else in this Matthew passage. They've also heard people say what else? Hate your enemy. Where does that come from? That doesn't seem to be in that text. Well, it comes from the text, and this is where Jesus needs to correct some things. This is where the rabbi comes out and says, you have a misunderstanding. Because everything he says here in Matthew, it's not correcting the love your neighbor part, right? He doesn't have anything to say about that. He's good with the interpretation they already have in mind. It's the hate your enemy he's dealing with. And that's going to come from Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 3 through 6. You're not going to catch it when I read it. So let me read through it, and then I'll explain where it comes from. Because I think this is a bit of a stretch by the rabbis before Jesus. No Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even in the 10th generation. For they did not come to meet you with bread and water on your way when you came out of Egypt. And they hired Balaam, son of Beor, from Pethor and Aram Naharaim, to pronounce a curse on you. However, the Lord your God would not listen to Balaam, but turned the curse into a blessing for you. Because the Lord your God loves you, do not seek a treaty of friendship with them as long as you live. Okay. So this comes from a passage. I will build the context around the few verses I read here. God's telling his people that a specific group of foreigners are barred from joining them in the assembly at the temple. Now, this is actually based on that specific people's group lack of generosity. It's a consequence that he's laying out for them. The people that are referenced here, the Ammonites and the Moabites, they show up during Israel's time wandering the desert. They're out there for 40 years, and they're just trekking around as God leads them. And he leads them to the edge of these people's lands. And God says, send an envoy out to their king and ask for permission to just pass through the land. That's what Moses does. He sends out a message and he says, we just want to stay on your king's road. That's it. We're just trying to pass through. We're not going to stay. We don't want your food. We don't want your water. We will not leave this road. We will supply ourselves. We just want transport. And that king responds by saying, absolutely not. You cannot come through our land. Israel has, a couple 100,000 people, and I can understand being weary about potentially letting an army through. I can understand that a little bit. So Moses sends a second message and just says, look, truly all we want is safe passage. We're not looking to stay. We're not looking to take anything. And if anything is taken, if our people take an apple from a tree or drink water from a well, we will repay you for it. We will pay you back for anything that might potentially be taken. And then the king responds again, and this time he doesn't just send a messenger, he just sends his army out to the border. He says, go ahead and take a step over and see what happens. That's the response that he gives him. Okay? So, not only is he refusing him passage, he's saying, if you even think about trying to take the peaceful act you've requested, we're going to slaughter you. Now, this is a consistent response for God and his value of generosity throughout Torah. He sees these people that are being patently and blatantly ungenerous to these Israelites in need. Remember, they're just a vagabond culture. They'd spent 400 years in slavery, and they're just wandering through the desert. This is not an impressive soldier state, okay? The rabbis actually teach that generosity of Abraham is why God chose him to be the father of his chosen people in the first place. We don't have time to unpack that today. That's a sermon on its own. They also teach that the lack of generosity is the reason that God destroys Sodom and Gomorrah. I don't know if you've heard that take before. That's not how we usually teach it. But God's response to generosity, both in the positive and the negative, is all over Torah. So this response that God has of, hey, don't let them in your assembly. This is how they treated you. That's pretty consistent with how God has treated that throughout the scripture so far. Now, what this passage isn't, though, is a universal edict of hatred. That's a real big stretch to take it that way. This is the verse that cultural phrase, hate your enemies, sprang out of. And it's badly out of line. And that's why Jesus is correcting it. You'll notice nothing he says here is attempting to change the love your neighbors interpretation. Just the hate your enemies part. God outlines a consequence here for people that refuse to be generous to Israel in a time of need. But he's not telling them to wipe them out or plunder their cities or to hate them. What's more is he isn't telling Israel to treat any other people this way. It is 2 tribes of the entire globe. Don't let them in the temple. That's it. Saying hate your enemies in response to that, really out of line. So, for example, to drive this point home, I cut that off where I did for a reason, because there's 2 more verses right after that passage in Deuteronomy I just read that are really relevant for driving this message home. Verses 7 and 8. Do not despise an Edomite, for the Edomites are related to you. Do not despise an Egyptian, because you resided as foreigners in their country. The 3rd generation of children born to them may enter the assembly of the Lord. Now, you resided there as foreigners is a really interesting way to describe Egypt. I might define them as the place you were held as slaves for 400 years and had to escape. Also, certainly an enemy. Who would you consider more of an enemy? The people that enslaved your family for centuries and then attempted to kill you when you left. And it's only through the intervention of God that you've made it to the desert to ask for the safe passage that was denied you, or the people that just denied you the passage on their road. Who do you think of as the enemy there? Egypt, right? And God says, yeah, in the 3rd generation, they can go ahead and enter the assembly. After 3 generations, that's fine. And yet God gives absolutely no direction for Israel to treat Egypt any differently than any other people in the world. So instead, Jesus gives this correction. He says, love your enemies. Now, why? Why would God want this to be done? Doesn't God want his enemies eliminated? And shouldn't we expect the same of his people? Yes. Actually, yes. I would actually agree with that sentiment. But what God is doing is he's attacking the methodology by which that happens. War only entrenches enemies and likely grows their number. Look at modern events today, and you can think about the line of division that we talked about politically from earlier. As opposed to, say, 3 years ago, do you think more or less people think of Russia as an enemy? More, okay. What about Ukraine? Would you? 3 years ago, did you have feelings about Ukraine at all? Okay, I see some yeses. That surprises me. I didn't. If people had said Ukraine, I said, oh yeah, one of those small Nordic countries that we don't think about. They're out there. They don't have an economy that affects us. I've never heard a word about whatever their standing military does, if it even exists. But today, I don't know that a lot of people think of Ukraine as enemies, but some do, because the political divide, there's plenty of people that don't want to support Ukraine. And they think of them as enemies just because they might take some money to fund that military. What about Palestinians or even Israel themselves compared to 3 years ago? More people going to think of them as enemies than they did 3 years ago? Have they done any of those people? Have they done a thing to us? and yet our view of them has changed. Because combating your trials via warfare, it creates enemies, and not just with the people that you're actually going to war with. You don't eliminate enemies by destroying them, but by peacemaking. And this is where I get to show off my family a little bit as an example here. So first of all, if you want to throw up the photo I gave you earlier labeled Nova. That's the one. That's my little 12-year-old wiener dog-ish mutt mix. Every time I leave the house, she grabs one of my shoes and takes it somewhere to snuggle up with so she can still smell me. It's very cute. Occasionally it's pajama pants. She'll pull those off my bedroom floor and carry them upstairs with her. When I'm traveling and I don't leave my shoes behind because I only have one pair, my parents will complain that regularly Nova carries a pair of underwear out of my duffel bag downstairs and snuggles up with them on the couch. Pretty sweet. Or is it? Here's the thing about Nova. Nova loves me. Nova tends to love men, not so much women, and definitely not other animals. She's not great with other animals, even the ones that live with her. So about 3 years ago, I adopted another dog. Her name's Marvel, and that's the spoiler photo that came up before. That's Marvel. Marvel's about a 5-year-old. She's a little whippet lab mix. She has the most relentless energy of any dog I've ever seen. And unfortunately, unlike Nova, Marvel loves every other dog. And she wants every other dog to be her best friend. And she asks every other dog to play with her by barking at them. It's not a good instinct. She's generally smart, but I cannot train this out of her. It's never worked. I've never seen another dog respond to her bark by saying, "Oh, awesome, that means you want to play." Because that's not how dogs communicate, except Marvel. How do you think Nova feels about Marvel? She hates her. Also, Marvel's like twice her size. Nova's got little dog problems, little dog energy. And for 3 years now, their relationship has been pretty tense. She'll tolerate Marvel. Marvel's favorite game is to chase the laser pointer. Nova's really dumb. Nova has no idea how the game works. She just knows we're playing when the laser pointer gets picked up. And she chases Marvel chasing the laser pointer. But if Marvel runs too fast or too close to her, she jumps up and snaps at her neck and snarls, and Marvel gets sad and stops playing for a couple of moments. Because Nova still sees this dog as a threat. Now, Marvel's demeanor doesn't help with that, because she communicates her desire to be friends by speaking war. Bark, 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 bark. I don't have enough energy for Marvel, and Nova's not going to help solve that problem. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I adopted another dog. So that Marvel would have someone to play with that isn't me. So now we have Valeria. Now this sweet little pit bull that has absolutely stolen my heart came home to live with me close to 3 months ago now. So she's still pretty new in the home. How do we think our relationship with the existing dogs is? It's great with Marvel because Valeria loves everybody. Everybody. The day I brought her home, I walked through the door, and I have a cat too. And the cat's right there, and she walks right past it. Doesn't care at all. Sees my roommate, hasn't met my roommate, doesn't know the roommate, and immediately runs over, jumps up on him, pat, 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 pet me, pet me, pet me, can I kiss your face, I love you. And has no thought of attacking the cat like you'd expect a dog to do on the way. Valeria's been a very good dog. She's needed a little training, but she's caused no social problems until Friday after I'd written this sermon. I don't know if you guys have pit bulls or are familiar with them, and she's kind of a runt. She's like skinny, and then it's like a hippopotamus head. Like it's enormous, it's thick, it's this, I feel like the skull's a third of her body weight. Well, she didn't like that I left that morning, so I get a call while I'm on campus doing some tabling in the student union building trying to connect with new students. Someone says, "Hey, I think your dog's at my house." I'm like, "What?" And when they said Valeria, that really surprised me because Marvel likes to get out. Whippet's a greyhound mix if you don't know the breed, so when she sees open space, she runs, and she may or may not come back. So I hear Valeria's out. I'm like, well, that's cool, but how did Valeria deal with getting out? She saw a neighbor, ran up to him to become best friends. And the neighbor said, "Oh, you probably shouldn't be running free," and read her collar, and then just walked her home, called her by name, till she got her back through the fence, closed the gate, and said, "You've got like a 6 by 6 inch chunk of your gate that's gone." What I believe happened is Valeria didn't like that I left and headbutted it and used her aggressive skull to just shatter the wood that was keeping her in the yard and tried to follow me. Before I could get home, she had left again. I took some boards, screwed them back up over the gap, and went back out to do something else with my afternoon. And then I got a third phone call. And for the third time that day, she had gotten out and just found a stranger and befriended them. And they called me and said, "Hey, your dog's out," because she had just pulled the new boards off or knocked them down with her giant thick skull again. So I get back home, and this time I secure them from both sides with 8 screws, and I have like 2x4s. She's not getting through again. So Valeria is home until like 9 o'clock that night. I'm home this time, but a friend comes over, and they don't check that the gate latches closely enough when they leave. And Valeria sees it's open and runs off and makes another friend. And someone else calls me and says, "Hey, I have your dog. She's really sweet, but can I bring her home?" And I'm like, "Yes, please do." Now, she had caused no problems until Friday and got out 4 times in one day. And she made 4 friends. Okay, this is peacemaking. And this is what she does too. Nova hates her, growls at her, snarls when she gets too close. Nova's okay with Marvel now because she's not the new stranger on the block. Took 3 years, but she kind of goes to Marvel for safety. And she's terrified of Valeria. But Valeria would still like to be friends with Nova. And how does she act on that? She gets down on her hands and knees and like whimpers or nudges at her or rolls over and tries to befriend her by loving her. Now, keep in mind, for 3 years, Nova and Marvel never really became friends. I've got a video here that's about 6 weeks after I brought Valeria home, if you want to play that video. This doesn't look like much, but like I mentioned, Nova's real dumb. Like, this is the closest thing to playing that she understands how to do. She is, Valeria, by acting sweet and lovingly, unlocked a friend in 6 weeks that Marvel couldn't make in 3 years. Did I tell this story largely so I could show you my adorable dogs? I mean, kind of. But I think it also drives home a point. You don't make peace through war. There's no limitations that God, Jesus, specifies here about what it looks like to love your enemies. And he's even being explicit about how. Pray for your persecutors. Not just like, yeah, I love you. I think we say we love our enemies a lot in our culture by saying, I'm not acting out of aggression towards you. I'm just going to let you have your space. I'm going to respect that you have your space. I'm not going to engage in it. I'm going to pretend that you're not there. And I'm still kind of going to pray that your influence goes away. That's not what God says. I get these emails once a week from an organization called Voice of the Martyrs. They just send me updates from persecuted Christians around the globe. They give me 3 examples every week and say, here's how you can pray for these people. And inevitably, these words ring through my ears as I'm actually doing so. And I find that as much of my time in that prayer is praying for the persecutors as it is for those who are oppressed. Because truthfully, if a recent Muslim convert is being hunted by her husband who wants to kill her for leaving the faith, and he changes his mind, or that solution goes away, there's probably more persecution to follow from someone else. Wiping out one enemy doesn't solve the problem. Changing the hearts of those enemies does. I finally, often as much, I pray for those oppressed people, not only that they'll be okay, but they'll still love the people that are the cause of their persecution. Because that's how the kingdom of Jesus is going to grow. Rome hates their enemies, and so did all the nations around Israel. I would argue as a nation, every single government around the globe does today. We may not use that word because it's not diplomatic, but our actions dictate that. But how you treat your enemies shows how you also serve a different God. One that isn't concerned or worried about the threat of those people, but of the redemption of them. Okay, so we've got all that cleared up. But of course, that does beg the question. We've talked about how God wants us to treat our enemies. He says, love your neighbor. So now we have to answer the question, well, who's my neighbor? And this passage doesn't actually attempt to answer that question at all, but Jesus does face that question directly elsewhere. And I'm guessing it's a passage that you're even more familiar with. So we'll be in Luke chapter 10 for our next chunk. And that'll be in verses 25 through 37. It won't take long for you to realize you all know this passage. On one occasion, an expert of the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this, and you will live." But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" In reply, Jesus said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. 'Look after him,' he said, 'and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." Like I said, I'm running the hits today. We all know this one, yeah? The Good Samaritan. This is probably like a top 5 passage in all of Scripture people know. But again, I'm going to do the Hudson thing. Let's talk about the context a little bit. Who are Samaritans? Do you actually know who Samaritans are? Any ideas? Huh? Okay. Yeah, the enemy. Why are they half Jewish? So they used to be fully Jewish. They were part of the tribe of Israel, and they splintered. And they splintered for a specific reason. And it's kind of a small thing. I think last time I was here, actually talked about like church division and some of the silly things that we split over. It's hard to call this silly in the culture that they lived in so long ago, but it would seem trivial to me today. they disagreed over where the place to worship God should be. They were given the law at Mount Sinai. The Samaritans said, well, we should just stay at Sinai. That's where we worship God. Everyone was like, no, we're going to the promised land, and his temple will be in Jerusalem. And then they split. And Israel would not acknowledge or treat Samaria as their allies after that. And so, yeah, Samaria ends up being half Jewish because they've been rejected by their tribe, so they start intermarrying with other people. Now, God was the cornerstone of the civilization, so that divide never resolved. That place of worship was really important, and it is just as important at the time Jesus is walking the earth as it was 2,000 years before. They have the brightest, shiniest temple yet in Jerusalem. They worship the same God in different places, and they despise those that they believe rejected the proper way of worship, each other. Now, they're still family, but they think of each other as enemies. Think of them almost like, in modern context again, California and Texas, both Americans. They like each other. How do those states interact with each other? I mean, it might as well be like Israel and Iran, it feels like some days. Like, if they could get away with bombing each other and not cause a civil war with the other 48 states, I think they probably would. That's kind of what this is. Yeah, we're part of the same family, but we really hate each other, and we're going to do everything we can to make sure that the other fails. So that's the relationship Samaria and Israel has. Now, the other thing we're told about the location of this road is it's going from Jerusalem to Jericho. It says down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Jericho's actually north of Jerusalem. When it says down, it literally means down, because Jerusalem's on a hill. They're leaving this mountain area, and they're going down into level land. But what's more important, that's only about an 8-mile stretch from Jerusalem, which is the capital of Israel, 8 miles to Jericho. That's nowhere near Samaria. It's important, and we're told that location specifically in this parable because Jesus wants us to know, because he doesn't give us by name who the man is that gets beaten up. But given on the location, what can we presume? He's an Israelite, right? Wouldn't be a reason for a Samaritan to be on that road. When they are, it's pretty noteworthy. The Samaritan certainly doesn't live in this area. He's a traveler. Now, Jerusalem is likely the residence of the priest, and that's where the temple is. So not only is he a kinsman to this wounded victim on the road, he's likely really close to his home, with plenty of options to care for him nearby. The priest would be made unclean by touching him if he's dead. There's all sorts of laws in the Torah about uncleanliness. That being said, they said he looks half dead. They might even think he's dead. You won't know. You're not unclean by looking at a dead body. You can get close and find out. And even if he was dead, here's the thing. He has a responsibility to see him buried even if he is dead. That would outweigh the responsibility he has legally to maintain his cleanliness. When you read all these, if you have read them, I know Leviticus is not most people's favorite, but if you have read all the cleanliness laws, one thing that's important to remember is that when you're unclean, that does not mean you've committed sin. It's a standard for how do you just be in the same level of the holiness region that God's in so that you can go into the temple safely. But if you aren't clean, you haven't sinned. A woman, by law, is unclean every single month when she menstruates. Is menstruating sinful? No. I hope we're universal on that. Okay? Uncleanliness is not a sin. But leaving a body exposed for bandits and the crows and not giving it a proper burial, that would be considered sinful in that culture. So the priest actually has an obligation to do the opposite of what he does here, whether he thinks the guy's dead or not. But either way, he doesn't care, and he just moves on down the road. Now, this next traveler is a Levite. He's not a priest, but he is from the tribe all the priests come from. So he's going to know the laws just as well. And he's also going to know that expectation that he loves his neighbor. But he doesn't care either. He just keeps on moving down the road. And then the Samaritan helps. But he doesn't just help. Unlike the locals, he helps at a great cost. He's not anywhere near home. A Samaritan would not have lived here, and neither would his family, because his family would have been enemies too. They're not intermarried with people in Jerusalem. That means he's probably working. It's the only reason he would be on this road. Probably a merchant peddling his goods, taking things around to sell. Now, if I see someone broken down or injured when I'm driving back to Moscow today and I stop and help them and they live in Lewiston, I'm probably going to lose a couple of hours of my time and 20 hours in gas to help them out. That solves the problem. If they're bleeding out, maybe I'm also sacrificing the upholstery in the back seat of my car while I get them to a hospital. But that's the extent of my losses. Let's think through the Samaritan. He gives the innkeeper 2 denarii. Anyone know what a denarii is? How much money is that? No one knows? A day's wages. Yep. So 1 denarii is just meant to represent a day's wages. So he just gives him, here's 2 full days of my work. Here's that as a down payment to take care of this guy. So at a minimum, he's giving up 2 days of his pay to pay for a stranger's care. But he also bandages him up. Now, first century folks, you hear bandaging him up, like, cool. I mean, that takes a little bit of time, but no big loss. These guys ain't traveling with a first aid kit. One of the most expensive and rare and valuable items they have in that society is just cloth. So when he bandages him, what's he using? His own clothing, right? Because the robbers stole the other guy's clothing. So he's tearing up, probably using a knife and cutting up his own clothing to bandage him. The vast majority of people in this world, if they're lucky, own 2 sets of clothes. So bandaging him is also a great expense, probably greater than 2 denarii. He also cleans his wounds with wine and oil. Is that how we would normally clean a wound? Is that what you think of for using to treat a wound? Now, he's probably treating his wound with that because that's what he has. Because I'm assuming, again, the only reason he'd be out here is for work. He's a merchant. He's using his supplies to treat him the best way he can. Sure, wine. I mean, today we might use some alcohol. Close. Oil would be more standard. They would use that. Also, oil, really expensive. If he's on his way to Jerusalem, there's a very good chance it's because he's taking oil, which would be highly valuable, to see if they will buy it at the temple and use it in all their ceremonies. And they will only buy the nicest oil to use for services in the temple. So, he's not only giving up 2 days' wages and his clothes, and he's promising he's going to come back and pay him more, right? The innkeeper later. That'll pay him more wages after that. And now he's actually using some of the goods that he's on the road to actually make a living with to treat his wounds on top of that. Then he puts him on the donkey, which means he's walking now. Okay? The Samaritan no longer gets to ride on the donkey. I don't know if you've been around donkeys. Not big. You ain't getting 2 full-grown men on there. He also promises to make that return journey to pay the innkeeper. So he's committing an unknown sum of money and his time to help this enemy in the future. The sacrifice here is immense. He's probably giving away days, if not weeks, of his time and wages to help this stranger. A stranger his society tells him that he shouldn't like. And the more appropriate treatment for him would have been to spit at him on the way by and leave him to rot. Now, Jesus doesn't actually answer this question that he is asked. Who is my neighbor? But as Jesus usually does when he is asked a question, he responds by doing what? There's a parable, but then after that, what? He asks another question. That's the rabbinical teaching model. Generally speaking, when you're asked a question, you respond with another question. The rabbi's goal is very rarely to tell you the lesson. It's to try and get you to think through it yourself. Learned knowledge is a lot more valuable than knowledge given to you. So he asked the question, who was the neighbor to the man in need? Now, this required the person he's speaking to consider the definition they would have normally considered. Now, in their society, they would have defined a neighbor as an Israelite. If you're part of the tribe, you are my neighbor. The outsiders, Samaritans, Romans, Egyptians, whoever else, that's the enemy. They only have two categories: neighbor, enemy. You're one or the other. You can't be both. And you can't be neither. But when we put the two stories together, oh no, sorry, I skipped a chunk. Jesus has the person here change their definition. Neighbors are no longer geographical or ethnic, but based on behavior. That's the answer he gives. Who was the neighbor? He said, the one that treated him this way, the one that acted with mercy. Which means he's also changing the status of enemies. Those who treat you with love and care are neighbors. And those who don't, in this story of the two Israelites, those two Israelites, the priest and the Levite, they're the enemies. Now, what else is really important about this distinction is, if we use the traditional Jewish definition to use, neighbor, one of the tribe, enemy outside of it, do you have any control over who is a neighbor and who's an enemy? Nope, it's decided at birth for you and them. You have no choice. What did Jesus just do? He changed the whole ball game. Okay? Now it's up to you to decide who's a neighbor and who's an enemy. When we put these two stories together, the Good Samaritan and the command to love enemies, though, does that definition even actually matter? Because what Jesus is doing here is he's changing how people get sorted into neighbors and enemies, but he's not creating a third category from which his words don't apply. He hasn't said there's still this vacant space in between where you can find a different way to treat them. He doesn't create a space for, say, your neighbors that you don't like. Okay? Still just two classes. Everyone falls into one of these camps, and Jesus says, love them all. The person on the side of the road could have been a priest himself or a Hamas leader, and Jesus doesn't think it's important to tell us which. What matters isn't that we can tell the two apart, but that we treat them the same. Folks, Jesus does not have a line of delineation for when we get to love someone and hate others. Whether they walk in lockstep with us or not, this world is full of enemies, and we show our faith in God by not worrying about that, by standing against the violence, whether it's physical or verbal, that seeks to denigrate others. Death is always a tragedy. Pastors or terrorists, activists or politicians, American or non-liberal or conservative. If you only find sorrow when your countryman dies, what are you doing more than others? If you rejoice when your enemies fall, do not even the pagans do this? How have we represented a loving God more than others? I leave you with these challenging questions. Thank you.